Hello and welcome. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm Managing Editor of Australia Institute Press, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar speaking about Australia Institute Press's first ever book, What's the Big Idea? I'm coming to you from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country today, and I would like to pay my respects to the storytellers who have looked after this land for many, many millennia and continue to do so. Just a reminder that you can register for upcoming book clubs on our website, australiainstitute.org.au/webinars. So you can type questions for our panelists at any time throughout the session today using the Q&A box, and you can upvote each other's questions if you see one that you like. Remember to keep things civil and on topic in the chat, otherwise we'll kick you out. And finally, this is a live event and it is being recorded. The video will be available on our website afterwards, australiainstitute.org.au. So I'm so thrilled to be joined by two contributors to the book today. Amy Remeikis, who's Chief Political Analyst at the Australia Institute. She was in the press gallery for, was it 8 years?
8 years, yeah.
At The Guardian, and you can read her excellent book On Reckoning about rage, abuse of women, and the world that papers over these phenomena. Welcome, Amy.
Hello.
And Alex Sloan AM is an award-winning journalist who spent 27 years as a broadcaster at the ABC. You very likely will have heard her on the radio, and if you're lucky enough to live in Canberra, then you may well have seen her excellent interviewing skills as well. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks so much.
So the whole purpose of What's the Big Idea is to be a book collecting together big ideas, solutions for some of the most wicked problems in Australia today. I think often we hear about how hard things are, how intractable problems are. This is a whole book showing that there are solutions, we just have to choose to implement them. So Amy's piece is about the lack of bravery in Australian politics, and Alex wrote about the role of the national broadcaster. And their contributions are just 2 of the 34 that we have in the book. So, Alex, let's start with you. In your piece, you discuss the importance of the national broadcaster, and we've seen this highlighted in particular with Cyclone Alfred in the past month. Can you talk a bit about what you see as the important role of the ABC?
Look, I think, I use that line in the essay that I know has been used many times, but I think we'd be a different country without the ABC. I know the ABC comes in for a lot of flack. There are commercial news organisations who spend a lot of energy writing columns or being on TV talking about just how bad the ABC is. But the ABC is an evidence, it's a truth-based journalist organisation. They aim for truth if they get it wrong. And of course, sometimes they get it wrong, they will correct it. Every media organisation sometimes gets it wrong. But they do have a brief of telling Australians what they need to know, not what they want to know. And so, yeah, I've just sat around too many tables, and I come from this, yes, as a broadcaster for nearly 3 decades with the ABC, just privileged to work for the organisation. But I grew up in regional Australia, rural Australia. The ABC was just absolutely part of my childhood. My mother used to walk with a radio in every room of our country house and in the garden. At lunchtime, when the workers came in to have lunch, there was the country hour, the River Heights and Blue Hills. And I was fascinated with this communication tool that was on the kitchen table. That's why I wanted to work for it. And I think it's even in these days now of disinformation and misinformation, we can trust the ABC to do the right thing, and it should be funded because our democracy relies on it.
And, you're talking about in the country, I think one of the perceptions, maybe misperceptions of the ABC is that it's a bunch of inner city people who are, projecting out into the regions. How does that fit with reality?
Go and talk to people in regional Australia. And that's an uncomfortable thing when it's being attacked from certain politicians, is that people in regional Australia, and yes, we've just seen the cyclone, fires, emergency broadcasting is absolutely vital. And you can hear those reporters with the croak in their voice that they have just worked around the clock. They are there, they understand their job. So go out to regional Australia, go to the nooks and crannies of places that are not serviced by the commercial media. There there is the ABC. And I absolutely think Australians still trust it. And I think in the Reuters monitor in the middle of last year, SBS and the ABC are still on top as the most trusted organisations.
Hmm. So, Amy, you worked for The Guardian in the press gallery. Of all of the places with high trust in Australia, press gallery may be a little bit questionable. Can you talk about the role of the press gallery in contemporary Australian politics?
Yeah, and I also worked for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age in the press gallery as well. That's who I started with when I came from Queensland, where I was state political editor for Fairfax. The role of the press gallery is it's meant to explain what the people on the Hill are doing in terms of policy, in terms of politics, and how that's going to impact people's lives. And people don't really think about federal politics in the same way that they think about state politics or even council politics, because all politics is local. The federal government gets a lot of attention, but really it's dealing with the money and the philosophy. It sets the bounds, and then the states take that money and then they use it to provide education, healthcare, the roads, all the rest of it. And then the councils take a little bit less, well, actually quite a lot of less of that money, and then they provide the daily services that we need. And so each of those in the chain are all very important to each other, but the federal politics, the federal government, they're the ones who are kind of dictating how this is all going to sort of play out. And there's a lot of very philosophical debates that happen in federal politics that I don't think get, a lot of attention. Like when we're talking about politics, when we're talking about cultural wars, what we're really doing is talking about philosophy, and we're arguing about which direction the country will be taking. And I think a lot of that gets lost because in the press gallery, you basically live there. You're isolated from the rest of the colleagues in your newsroom. Your colleagues become other people in different bureaus who are working for different organizations because you're all in the same hallway. You can't go out for lunch. You can't, if you're there for the week, you're there for the week. You arrive around 7 or so, you're leaving, after 6 or 7 p.m. or so. So your world becomes that building. And I think in doing so, the federal press gallery can become institutionalized in a way, because you're not getting a lot of those other outputs. And of course, we all have friends and family and you travel and things like that. But when your job is to find out what politicians are thinking, it tends to mean that you spend a lot of your time with politicians or staffers, and you start seeing things through the lens that they're presenting rather than how it might be interpreted by your audiences. And so I think in the modern setting, the press gallery, sure, it's meant to describe politics. It's meant to explain politics to Australian people. But because politicians aren't there for, half the year anymore, they're only there when they're in Canberra, it can become quite isolating. And I think we've reached a point now where the press gallery, not everyone, but just in general, in the broad, can be out of step in what people would like to see covered by the people who are shining a spotlight on their politicians. And at times, I think that means you might need to take a bit of a step back and perhaps step out of the press gallery, still cover politics, still see what's happening, but maybe just start to mix a little bit more with the people that you're meant to be explaining it for.
Mm. And one of the things that, is related to your essay and that we talk about a bit is the maintenance of the status quo, and how in Australia it's in a lot of people's interests for the world to largely continue the way that it is. It's comfortable, it's profitable, it's beneficial for them. How is there a relationship between sort of what you've described as a sort of insularity in the press gallery and the maintenance of the status quo?
Yeah, it's a hard one to answer, right? Because everyone is different. And I sometimes think that people don't even realize that they've become institutionalized. It's just, something that creeps upon you quite slowly. And I've caught myself at times when, I'm looking at an issue and I've immediately just jumped to the politics of it rather than just going, actually, no, this is going to be a really shit policy. It doesn't matter how this, how this plays in the politics. It doesn't matter that, these people can justify it because they're trying to head off something else happening in their party room. They're in charge of policy, and that policy is going to have XY consequences on people. So I've had to catch myself, plenty of times when my brain has just gone, oh, well, obviously, they're just doing it for these reasons. The justification doesn't matter. What matters is how we explain it to people, contextualize it to people, so they can make their own decision about the politics. And so when it comes to the status quo, I mean, there's security in there, there's safety, there's, the appearance of stability, where it just seems like if everyone just did what we've always been doing, then we know how this is all going to play out. 1 and 1 equals 2. That's a very safe area for a lot of people. So we should all basically narrow our thinking that politics can only be in this one particular formula. Anyone who steps out of that, you're obviously just being a little bit radical. But what I don't think people realize in defending that status quo, or just sticking to the status quo in, this is how we do politics, this is how we cover parliament, this is how we explain and contextualize people's world, they're being just as much an activist as somebody who's going, hey, maybe there's a different way we could do this. It's just not seen as activism because it's about the status quo. So therefore it's seen as being sensible or, the center, when really, they're just defending the way that things have always been done, and they're choosing who they speak to and how they speak about it, and what adjectives they use and who they interview and the line that they take in these stories. They choose that to defend a particular position, and anyone who challenges that particular position, well, then they must be the radical, they must be the activist. And I don't think we've quite reckoned with that in the press gallery or in journalism as a whole.
Mm. And so, Alex, one of the things that seems critical for an engaged public is media literacy. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what measures we might be able to take to encourage greater media literacy in Australia.
Yeah, I think this has got to a crucial point. And I'm just coming off the back of listening to Michelle Ainsworth, who's working with the ABC. She actually did a Churchill Fellowship looking at truth, trust and democracy in the US, the UK and Finland. And she's just produced a 7-part podcast, which is via the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust site. For everyone, I absolutely think it should go into schools. It's the most, and she talks a lot. She's got probably the world experts on mis and disinformation. And even Antonio Guterres last year said this is probably the most crucial threat to democracy now in the world, that if we don't have great media and digital literacy programs across the world to understand what is coming at us, then democracy is really shaky. And it was really interesting that Michelle went to Finland because, of course, they border Russia. And so they got this a long time ago. They got propaganda coming across the border. They're right there on the border. So from age 6 in schools in Finland, they're taught media and digital literacy. They're taught how to decode ads, how to decode political messages. And I noticed actually in a measure today, they're still put at the happiest nation on earth at the moment. And that's the survey also shows us that where there is a strong public broadcaster, where there is strong media literacy, that the citizens are much more likely to be happier with each other. They won't turn to authoritarian leaders as an alternative to democracy, that democracies are much more stable in countries that have strong public broadcasters, who in turn, I think, are vital in that whole media literacy education arm.
And we're coming up to an election. It's going to be called very soon now. What kind of role do you see, well, first of all, that the ABC is playing, but that the ABC can play in a federal election?
You know what, Australians, I would push for one of your parties to fund the ABC properly, to actually boost its funding. I think this is a real time in our history. And just speaking of Finland, actually, and again, I'll reference Michelle Ains' podcast, I think America spends something like $4 a year on public broadcasting. The Finns spend nearly $100 a year for each Finn. And I think we're in the $20 mark, like, So I think we can afford to boost SBS, the ABC. And again, I can see in the chat people saying, oh, Radio Australia was cut. Absolutely, I'm with you on that. Why was that cut? It was a form of soft diplomacy. I was a volunteer in Papua New Guinea for a couple of years in a very remote place, relied on Radio Australia and the Voice of America and Radio Moscow, actually. I used to listen to all three of them. So I think if you were a smart politician now, I would be saying it's vital that we have a really healthy public broadcasting system, and that's both the ABC and SBS, of course.
And Amy, what kind of ABC coverage do you think would help the electorate in a federal election? What would you like to see?
Well, it's hard, right? Because none of us have eyes on the whole ABC, because Alex is absolutely right. Like, what is happening in local communities with the local radio is completely different to what's happening on ABC 24 or some of the flagship programs that suck up a lot of the, the energy and the light. And I've previously worked for ABC local radio on the Sunshine Coast, and I have, many friends and mentors who are in it, and it provides an absolutely crucial service to communities where, they do get politicians on to answer all of your questions. And, they do go, hey, why hasn't that pothole been fixed? Why is the funding for this hospital being held up? Why do we have ambulance ramping? Why do we not have proactive programs, in terms of bail laws and all the rest of it? They're discussing those big issues, and they're bringing communities in. And you can tell that when people talk about loving the ABC, more often than not, that's what they're talking about, that direct link between their local ABC and the community. And, when I worked for the ABC, that was so clear to me, because I would go down to the local shops and people would see me and, talk to me about how I pronounced a town wrong or something like that, which of course is very important to them. Most of the time when I pronounce things wrong, I have a speech impediment, but it's, it is very important to people because they care about their communities so much. They want the people who reflect their communities to understand and also speak back, to them in languages that they understand. It is absolutely crucial. But then you have, wider ABC, which is the one that we always talk about when we're talking about the big bad ABC. And, that's your 24, that's your flagship programs like 7:30 and RN and Four Corners and all the rest of it. And I think that there can be a frustration when you're talking about that part of the ABC, because that can get caught up in this day-to-day sort of mess that we're all in. And it doesn't necessarily answer some of the questions that people want. Sometimes interviewers can fall into the same trap that every journalist that's entirely focused on one section falls into, which is just playing to that section rather than to the wider audience. Or they're so worried about attacks which have come to the ABC because of, Senate estimates, where basically we all know that there are certain coalition and conservative senators who are going to absolutely drag some poor ABC employee through the mud over something that was said, usually without context, usually without taking into account any of the surrounding things that have happened around this program or this statement, that they're absolutely going to blow it up. And then there's elements of commercial media like News Corp, particularly the Australian, but increasingly so the Daily Mail, that are then just going to blow it up. And then you'll have the shock jocks on 2GB who are then going to make it an absolute issue because somebody on the ABC dared to say something like trans kids have rights too. It doesn't matter. And so it gets to the point where you see some interviewers, some people in the ABC so worried about that backlash that they stop asking those questions, they dance around them, or they try to do something that a lot of journalists do, which is ask the question using the language of the person who is like, trying to blow up some issue, with the idea being that it's going to expose them for being so ridiculous. But really, it just kind of sounds like almost complicit endorsement, or that you're giving them a platform to continue saying, these sorts of things with very little pushback. And we're taught in journalism school that you should let people speak because, they're going to hang themselves with their own words. But there is a fine line between, letting people speak and then also interrupting, with facts, at the end of that. And I sometimes feel the ABC, like every other organization, doesn't do that as well as they could, which then starts to mean that people who are watching this start to wonder, why is there not this pushback? Because this pushback is very important to them. And so then that adds into the criticism. And so then you've got two groups of people very angry at the ABC for two very different things. But I think that we also need to remember that the ABC is so large, it's so many different points.
If 50 radio networks.
There 50, we go. Yeah. If you're and it's online and it's podcasts and it's content, like if you're angry at a particular interviewer about a particular interview, that's one thing. But if you're then just like, I am now going to go on a crusade to make this person's life entirely hell because of a dress they wore, the color of the skin, or something they said, and I'm not going to listen to any of the reasons of why, or any of the other interviews that have been put in place to try and address some of the issues that were raised in this ongoing conversation, then maybe you need to think about your role in the criticism and what it is you actually want to achieve as well.
If I can just come in there, when I started with the ABC too, it was actually, I started in Hobart in Tasmania, and they gave us these, little lovely sort of intro courses, and in came the lawyers, the defamation lawyers, and they said, look, we'll defend you. Like, just do your job, of course you aim for truth. You do fact-based journalism. But look, if you get in trouble, we're there to defend you. So always make it, here's the number to call if you want to check that something is okay to go to air. By the end, when I was leaving, literally, you weren't allowed to take any of those. And of course, you always rang the lawyers. You'll run off their feet to check if this was going to be defamatory, and hopefully you had good literacy skills about that. But it was very much a no-no being called into the manager's office. Why did you do that? It was a complete, it was, overcorrection. Amy's right. An absolute
it's
cautiousness and
a
the
bit of self-censorship.
Truth gets lost in it.
Yeah. And as we were talking shortly before everyone came on, it does become, I think, and it's not just the ABC that's guilty of this, it's all media organizations. Journalists start self-censoring themselves because they're worried about the backlash, and that backlash isn't huge. It's just a minority of voices, but they're very loud in the Australian cultural space. It is very uncomfortable if News Corp is coming after you. Yep. It's very uncomfortable if 2GB is coming after you. They will trawl through your life. They will go through absolutely every social media post you have ever made and try to tangibly link it to one comment that was made on one program. The ABC is one of the only stations that still does, panel programs regularly, lots and lots of different panel programs where they invite lots and lots of different voices on. And those voices are made up of the Australian community. So they are obviously reflecting elements of the Australian community. But we've seen those shows, be cancelled or become very sanitized. Like The Drum was cancelled. Q&A is an exceptionally sanitized version of what it used to be, like under Tony Jones. Insiders has a particular, group of people that it will have on over and over again. And I truly believe it's just because, like, we're so worried about somebody saying something unsafe, not because of how the audience is going to react, but because of how certain elements of the media will react and how some politicians will then exploit that to make it a bigger issue. And so what we have is a cowed media, a cowed public broadcaster who are not going as far into things as they need to go and are not saying the things that need to be said, or even allowing people to come on to say those things for them, because ABC journalists obviously have the charter which they have to stick to, because they're so worried about that backlash. And I just kind of sit sit back and wonder and go, where are the people defending this? Are we so intent on having such a narrow national conversation that we are going to exclude uncomfortable to some voices because we are so terribly worried about what somebody might say? And I think you can say that's exactly what happened to Antoinette Lattouf in local radio. There was nothing that she said on air that was a problem. There was just a perception that it could become a problem because there were complaints made about some, positions she had taken in Israel-Palestine, throughout her life, to the point where now sharing a Human Rights Watch report was deemed to be controversial. Like, this is the kind of climate that we've created and allowed to create by not sticking lines in the sand to defend the ABC and to defend wider journalism, to say we can talk about these uncomfortable things, because we've allowed incrementally so many people to fall victim to cancel culture in terms of they've said something uncomfortable about Australia's identity, about Australia's positioning, about what it's like to be an Australian who's not middle class white, and whatever else, what it's like to be that person in Australia. We've collectively allowed a small group of people to say, can't talk about that, that's uncomfortable, and we're going to go after this person. And this is what we're left with now. I think a cowed media and a cowed national broadcaster who is very afraid to allow certain voices on because some people might get upset, and that's terrible for democracy.
It's all, and Yasmin Abdel-Majid, she again reposted and then took it down. But
all
really,
she said was like, lest we forget
let
the people
children,
of Nauru,
the little children, exactly. And she was chased out of Australia. She was at one stage described as Australia's most hated person. She's a magnificent woman. I met her soon after this happened, and she was so deeply hurt. And she's left Australia now. She was educated here. She loved this place, and that's the way we treated her. And it's a shame. That was a shameful episode.
And she'd built up a career here.
She was amazing.
Having to start that again somewhere else.
From engineering to, she was across the whole lot. She was fantastic.
Alex, one of the changes that you would have witnessed is the rise of social media. And so Amy's been talking a bit about how that feeds into treatment of employees at our national broadcaster. What do you see as the shifting space of social media, and how does that affect our democracy? Not a very small question. How does it affect our democracy?
Well, democracy for us, Alex.
Well, I think now, in my essay, I gave some figures, but I think that's already out of date. I think it depends on the generation. So younger people, most of them get their news from social media. They're not sitting down at the 7 o'clock news or 7:30. Or they probably don't know what a newspaper is. So they are getting most of their information from social media. And, if you go to America at the moment, of course, Musk bought Twitter, X. He has used that for power. He took that out of the Murdoch playbook, and I'll quote Michelle's podcast, what Murdoch did was place the aggrieved conservative in the middle, make them a victim, and make sure that, they were very angry. They're very angry. Musk has taken this supercharged it. It makes a huge amount of money. To have people anger quickly is a very, very good money model. So I think that's where we're at. We've got people running to their corners, to their echo chambers, only hanging out with people that think like them. And that, what's that old saying? If you want to have it, I'll find the quote in a minute, but, I'll go back to making people angry. It makes money. It sends us to our echo chambers. We're not even understanding what the other people think. I recently did an amazing, Geraldine Brooks is doing a book tour at the moment with her book about the death of her husband, Tony Horwitz, the amazing journalist. And she made the point, and it was lovely to be able to get her to sit and talk about Tony. And I think that's why she's loving she said, he's the kind of journalist that would have sat down with all those people who went to the January 6th trying to overturn the American democracy, she said, rather than judging them, and he would have gone to the pub with them afterwards and talked to them and tried to understand where they're coming from. So I think we've lost that ability because we're now so polarised, and social media is just a huge part of that. And I hope that's what the ABC can continue to do. And I know I can see people going, oh, the ABC is putting Peter Dutton on too much. The ABC has to put Peter, he's the opposition leader, You may not like Peter Dutton, but listen to Peter Dutton, listen to Albanese, listen to the Greens, listen to, that's what the ABC is for. So we're not just in our corners. I don't know how that went in terms of but that I think is what really threatens democracy. I think that's what America has faced. And in Michelle's podcast, you have a lot of the experts at the university going, we don't have a democracy anymore. We have an oligarchy. It's run by the social media tech billionaires.
And I agree with what Alex is saying there, to a certain extent, but I think I think we understand where a lot of these people are coming from. And I think that we're slightly beyond sitting down with the most extreme version of that because they don't want to listen to the other side either. And that is the crucial part of this, is that you often just feel like, well, you need to sit down and understand, the male loneliness epidemic or something like that. I would say that there have been, I'm using something deliberately outside of politics too, but I would say that there are a lot of women who understand the male loneliness epidemic, but it doesn't matter what they do, there is still going to be a group of men who are going to hate women and actively work to make other men hate women. And the only way that you can kind of address that sort of thing is to have a whole of society shift and talk about it. Yeah. But the issue that I have with we just need journalists, sitting down and talking to the insurrectionists or whatever, is that I think in limiting our national conversation and going to your point, Alex, about how, rage wins, like the algorithm is basically based to make you angry because you spend more time on social media if you're infuriated, and that's how they make their money. So they don't, if you're happy, you're just like, oh, that's a nice kitten, whatever, and put the phone down. They don't want that. They want you infuriated so that you stay online arguing with people or bots or whatever, and spend more and more time on there because that's where their money comes from. But I think in all of that, we are now framing our national conversation through the lenses of those people who are the loudest voices there. And so I think when people complain, oh, the ABC has Peter Dutton on too often, or the media is doing too much Peter Dutton says, the complaint there is that we are framing the national conversation through what the opposition leader is saying rather than what the response is or challenging that person. Because none of us would accept, the Prime Minister says, the Prime Minister says, the Prime Minister says, and have that as the only, as the main lens that we view politics through. But we do in the media, I think, get caught up because we're relying on the same thing, that we're going to make people angry by our headlines, and then maybe they'll click on the story, maybe they'll stay there a little bit longer. We have subconsciously or not started framing things through the person disagreeing, with a minority view. A lot of the time we're framing it through the minority view of disagreement, and we're saying this is the main argument. And that's what I think social media has done to the media. I think that social media has formed communities for a lot of people. I think that it's given a lot of people who would never actually find acceptance, it's found their people for them, and it's given people a lot of joy. But media has also taken the worst of social media, which is just infuriating people, getting their passions up in order to get them to click on stories. And now we're just stuck in this self-fulfilling prophecy, because a lot of the time, I don't care what the opposition leader says. I don't care what the Prime Minister says. I care about what is this policy? What is this change? What is this debate doing to people? And I care about the facts and the truth in that. And we've kind of just push that aside. I mean, there was a story I read in the Australian earlier this week about how, days lost to industrial action since the Albanese government took over are skyrocketing. And they had this incredible graph crime where they just added up all of the days lost since May 22. So of course, the line just went up and up and up because you're just adding more days. It's not showing you historically what it looked like in the last parliament or the parliament before that. It was just, hey, there's more days and this graph is going up. And in that story, in the bottom third of that story, it had a quote from someone saying, we're at historical lows for industrial days lost to industrial action. Under the current government, it's 2.2. Under the former Morrison government, it was 2.4. So that comment in that story completely just basically said the rest of the story was bullshit. And it was in the story. It was just in the bottom third. And this is what we're doing, so often, because people just read the headline, they read whatever the first couple of paragraphs are, and then they get angry about it. And then there's debates all over the place about it. And then the Prime Minister is asked about it, and Peter Dutton is asked about it. And they each say their thing. And then the story becomes about what each said about the incorrect story. And we're again in this cycle over and over and over again. So I don't necessarily think it's just sitting down. I think that it is about actually journalists doing their job and elevating facts above passions, elevating facts and reason and figures and actual critical questions when they're needed over the emotional, the opposition leader said, the Prime Minister said.
No, I agree totally, Amy. Yeah, I'm absolutely on the same board. I mean, I think Trump really built the cap recently in the Oval Office thing with Zelensky when he kind of stopped and went, "This is going to make great television." I thought, yeah, that's what it's all about. Forget about world peace or making the world a better place. Great, you're going to have great television ratings. So
how can I make money out of it?
Yep. And there it was. I thought, well, at least you've illuminated it. Sometimes, when he pushes back on stuff, you can work out exactly what the truth is because he's being so defensive about it. So,
yeah. We have tons of great questions. Just a reminder, some people have raised their hands, but the way we do question and answer in book club is that you type it into the chat box and then I can read them out. So we have a question from Chris Truman who asks, do you think ABC's Media Watch should be expanded to expose more how political advertising in particular can totally lack truth? And what if it included, Tony Kennedy has added, what if it included radio as well as television and maybe streaming services?
Couldn't agree more. Going to need some funding for that. I noticed that the Albanese government put, was it 4 million towards media literacy at the end of last year? Drop in the ocean. It's going to take an awful lot of money, but yeah, I think the public broadcaster has an enormous role. I mean, I know I gave the Finnish example about schools and we just load so much on our teachers, but in those podcasts, actually, they talk about maybe teacher training, that teachers need to be completely across media and digital literacy as well. And then that goes into every class rather than having specific classes. But I think it's going to have to become part of our education system as well as our public broadcasters doing work in this space.
Or you could just really, really push your politicians, particularly if there's, I don't know, a minority government potentially on the horizon in the future, to actually pass comprehensive truth in advertising laws. I mean, the reason that they don't want to do it is because they both like the ability, both the major parties, like the ability to stretch the truth. But the problem with that is that they, for so many years, relied that the truth would be stretched in particular areas, but overall, everyone was going to have some good faith agreement about what you could and couldn't put in political advertising. That is completely out the window. That is gone. We are so far beyond that, but they're still maintaining this idea that you can trust them to put in, something approximating the truth. You don't even need a grain of truth in political advertising anymore. It doesn't matter. And it's got nothing, there's no eyes on how they're advertising on social media, because in social media, it's about the algorithm. So Alex could be seeing seeing completely different ads to what I could be seeing, to what Alice could be seeing. And none of us would ever know that we're all seeing 3 different versions of something that is, tailored to whatever it is that gets us angry, which is usually how these ads work. And so our government is so far behind on that, it is actually tearing at the fabric of our democracy. And so if people don't actually start forcing politicians to respond to an actual real threat, this is not existential, this is a very real threat that we are all experiencing, then I don't even want to think about the path that we're going down.
There are a few questions, speaking about actually responding, there are a few questions about how do we get real responses in interviews, from politicians or from public figures. Is there a way to make that happen?
Alex, you probably did a lot more interviewing. How did you find that?
Look, I think most journalists will do their best to try, but you can hear that they start to preface the sentence with something, if I could say this, or if I could take you here. And at one stage you could tell the media training that all the politicians trainer that the politicians had been to about how to not answer the question and how to actually take it over here and how to, like, let's attack the ABC today, or let's attack greenies, or let's attack, whatever. It's a very hard thing, but look, I think our profession, Amy, tries its best and hopefully is on top of some of these tricks and obfuscations.
Yeah, I mean, the best way that I always found it was to know my stuff. Like, I knew the facts, and also not to make it too broad, because there is a bit of a panic that can go into interviews where, this person has maybe sat down very often and you've got all of these questions that you need to ask them and get answers on, and all of these competing issues. And politicians deliberately don't sit down for proper interviews anymore. They tend to hold doorstop interviews, which are very quick press conferences, or they'll hold a press conference where they know that there's going to be more than 20 journalists turn up, and every journalist, if they're lucky, gets one question. And because every journalist is from a different outlet or covering different states or whatever, they're not going to back up the person who just didn't get an answer. And that's one of the big issues I had going from state politics to federal politics, is that in the state gallery that I was part of, even though we were competing with each other and in a lot of cases didn't like each other, it was still us against the politician. So if a politician had tried to avoid answering a question, I would often just sacrifice my question and just be like, actually, no, you didn't answer that. So, what is it about blah, blah, blah. But I think if you know your stuff and you can actually, you let them ramble on, whatever, but then just be like, okay, well, the facts are X, Y, Z. Why are you not addressing this? You're not going to get them to say the answer, because they won't. Like, that's their, they see that as their job at times, is protecting the truth. But you can present the truth within that interview that makes it obvious that that politician does not want to say it or acknowledge it. And with media literacy, that can say everything to the people who are hearing that interview about why does this politician not want to address this. The problem is that you often have politicians now who are really good at bamboozling journalists, and we're having more politicians who are taking leafs out of Trump's playbook, the Timu Trump movement in Australia, where basically they turn on the journalist and they just, where are you from? Well, of course, that's a question that you would ask, blah, blah, blah. And they know that you want to defend yourself, and you have to actually put yourself aside and just be like, I'm not going to pay any attention to this. This is my question. And that's really hard to do. And I'm not sure if Australia's journalists have quite reckoned with that style of interviewing yet.
You hear that a lot. Where are you from? And I noticed with the clips when the Voice of America is getting huge funding cuts that Trump often used to, oh, you're Voice of America. Okay, yeah, okay, so you're fake news. And I thought the same tactics are being used here now.
There's a couple of questions about funding, and what better time than in an election campaign to talk about funding for the ABC. What kinds of changes do you think would need to be in place, and how do you think people should be communicating with the candidates in their local area?
Just get behind the ABC. I mean, in my essay in the book, it's like $750 million over the past 10 years has been cut out of the ABC. And that's the loss of 800 senior jobs. And that's what I said, you know, if you think the ABC has had to cut things and maybe get something wrong or things are rushed, there is a reason for that, because they're trying to put out just that huge amount of content across all those networks and different, you know, from podcasting to online. It has to be funded. So I think just the ABC is crucial, or SBS2, public broadcasting is crucial to our democracy. Please take that to your local member, whoever they may be, and just say, we're serious about this. Because I think, yeah, it's getting really quite worrying, I think, about more further cuts to the ABC. Look, I started working before Bob Hawke came into power. Bob Hawke, God, he labelled all these biases at the ABC over the war with the Middle East. It just, every single Prime Minister comes in with, it doesn't matter what colour they are, to talk about the bias of the ABC. And then, as I say, they also, both political parties, stack the boards with their mates. So I'd really like to see that stopped. I'd really like to see an independent panel that chooses the board members. This is an absolutely vital part of our country, is a healthy public broadcaster that preserves and protects our democracy. Take that to your local member, please, everyone.
Yes. So we have a question about from Jill Beringer about a moral panic in the country about anti-Semitism. And she asks, has the media done enough to balance that reporting by coverage on Islamophobia and to explain the dangers in the new definition of anti-Semitism that is gaining traction in public discourse and at universities?
I would say no. I would say that no, the media, politicians, and a lot of community leaders haven't done anywhere near enough to talk about the rise in Islamophobia alongside the rise in anti-Semitism. And we've had, politicians openly dismissing that Islamophobia, either exists or that there have been instances of it increasing. And just sort of, I think it was Dave Sharma, the Liberal senator from New South Wales, who said that every single time anti-Semitism is raised, the government will also raise some non-existent or words to that effect of Islamophobia. And that's really dangerous. It's really dangerous. And it does undermine trust in all of our institutions, because people can see with their own eyes what is happening on their streets, what is happening in their social media feeds. And they're hearing, in real time, examples of the rise in Islamophobia, as well as cases of the rise of anti-Semitism as well. But they're only hearing one side be addressed. And I think that this entire debate in Australia has been made around social cohesion. We hear our politicians talk about social cohesion a lot. But when you're not talking about all of it, about all racism, about all elements of, phobia and, assaults and hatred in Australia, if you're only talking about one, then you're doing nothing for social cohesion other than breaking it, because people start to wonder why you're not acknowledging the giant elephants in the room. So there hasn't been that acknowledgement. I mean, we recently saw a case in Queensland where a young Muslim man was shot and nobody heard about it. Whereas we know what would happen, if there was any hint of that being something that was anti-Semitic. So I think that has really undermined people's trust in the media, in their politicians, to be able to look at all issues completely fairly. And what do we do about it? I think what a lot of people are doing about it, which is asking their politicians to account for why they're ignoring such huge problems in Australia's society, because none of this happens in a vacuum and none of this is new. We know that over the last few decades, pretty much since September 11, we've seen massive increases in Islamophobia. The Islamophobia Register is constantly putting up updates of examples of what is happening in Australia Australia, and it's not being addressed, and it should be, just as we should address, anti-Semitism, just as we should address any form of racism or hatred. We are not. And the absence of that is what is tearing at social cohesion.
Everything that Amy just said, that she, and I'm not working as a current journalist at the moment, so I think that was fantastic. I worked on The Voice. I worked with Auntie Pat Anderson and Professor Megan Davis, and of course I saw incredible racism and just terrible double standards. And Auntie Pat also, I think Amy's point about the attack on the Muslim guy in Queensland, Auntie Pat said, we have Aboriginal women go missing all the time, Alex, but it doesn't get the focus. And absolutely, there can be biases and slants of the media that doesn't represent our whole population. And to see actually, I remember Megan Davis sitting at the ANU at a book conversation going, we are seeing active misinformation and disinformation being used in this Voice referendum campaign. Are we going to allow this to be now part and parcel of our election campaigns? And already we're seeing disinformation about Peter Dutton on TikTok, is that right, going on at the moment? I mean, it's here. It's here. So Amy's right about truth. We need to put in place. The ACT has. Come on, the rest of the country, and we'll be richer for it.
Yeah, and just the university definition of anti-Semitism, which is being increasingly adopted, that is quite dangerous. And there have been several human rights groups and Jewish groups which have raised that, not just people saying, oh, we're uncomfortable with it, because we're getting to the point where criticism of Israel is being considered anti-Semitic. So if you're criticizing a nation state and the actions of a nation state's government and military, that can be considered anti-Semitic under this definition. And that is what has, people really, really worried, because it's in the Macklemore song Hins Hall, where he says, like, it's not that they're protesting, it's what they're protesting about. And we have seen that quite frequently with the university protests or some of the anti-genocide protests, where there has been a conflation of criticism of Israel's actions in Gaza and in Palestine being called anti-Semitic. And then that has led to this, we have an anti-Semitism crisis. We absolutely have issues with anti-Semitism in this country. We always have. It's not something that we have ever got on top of, and we know that. But criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic. It is criticizing the actions of another nation. And we do that all the time, because that is part of our role as a country that has signed up to numerous, UN programs on human rights. We've signed up to so many doctrines of international law. It is actually our obligation to call out other nations when they are breaking human rights law, whether humanitarian law, international law. And when you have the leaders of a nation wanted on arrest warrants for crimes against humanity and war crimes, and you're not allowed to criticize the actions that they are doing in another nation against another people because you're afraid of being targeted for anti-Semitism, that again has massive, massive ramifications. And that is why we need to have a proper critical and rational discussion about some of these definitions of anti-Semitism that Australia's universities are adopting, because this knee-jerk overcorrection is not going to do anything other than cement more hatred and suspicion. And that's the opposite of what we're all trying to achieve.
Do you think it's possible to have that conversation, Amy?
Not right now, not with certain media outlets and politicians actively dictating what is allowable in terms of freedom of speech. And I just think that we're going to get to a point in another decade where, these crimes are being prosecuted in the correct authorities, and there will be rulings on those war crimes, and we'll have a bunch, just as we did after Iraq. Oh, if only we knew. And I just think we all know what is happening right now. We are all very capable of seeing that crimes against the civilian population is against international law. It is immoral, it is unethical, and it is genocide. and that we can't say that without being worried for our jobs, for being targeted in certain elements of the media, or to have politicians immediately say you can't talk about that is exceptionally worrying. And I think that people should be pushing back against the changes to the hate speech laws, because that is quite worrying. People should be really looking at what has been done to protest laws in this country, not just on this issue, but also on climate, because your rights to disagree or to actively express your opinion on what is happening in the world have been incrementally eroded over the years. And you're going to wake up one day and find that you're on the wrong side of those laws over an issue that you believe in, and go, how did this happen? It happened because we allowed it to.
Yeah, and so in the interest of stopping this from going further, but also in helping the next generations who already have to deal with a housing crisis that is unprecedented in Australia, and climate change, which is unprecedented, then they'll also have a media that's completely inadequate. What sort of changes would you like to see? This is my last question for the session. And obviously it's going to be a very easy fix for us just to snap our fingers and right this ship that's off on the wrong course. There's a question saying that the drum was axed because it wasn't attracting enough younger viewers, and a sort of a critique of that decision. What kinds of things do you think a broadcaster like the ABC could be doing to support younger people and help give them access to true information?
Well, I think just stop being so risk averse. Take a few more risks, be innovative. It was interesting. I do book conversations. So I was doing conversation with Wendy Harmer last year, and I said, would a show like The Big Gig ever get up? That was a live show. That was live and wild. Nah. The ABC would never take that risk. Some of the Andrew Denton shows, and you're getting sort of political commentary coming through those shows as well. No, they just wouldn't. I just think the ABC, needs to be less risk averse, but again, they need money for this. They need to be funded not under the threat of cuts the whole time, which is what they've been facing for over a decade now. So, to be fair to the managers and people, Amy's right. You've got a certain cohort who'll just lob a complaint email to those managers every day at local radio, and they have to respond to those. So they're tied up in the complaint process the whole time. Like, it's being gamed, that system of complaint at the ABC. So if people are frustrated with it, and I get frustrated with it, but I know that without it, this country is really going to be poorer. And I think our democracy will, democracies are quite fragile. I didn't realise this, but we're the 6th oldest democracy in the world. It is quite robust, but it doesn't take that much to start to erode it. So just back to your question, Alice, which was, what did you want me to do? I think I got to
looking to the future.
I'm looking to my friends, the Finns, again, and they have a fantastic slogan: truth is their superpower. So I think if we could turn our face to that, to get off social media. Look, I'm with Amy. There's good parts of social media, but a lot of the news, when you're being quick to anger, when you're being told stuff, I think start to be suspicious about it. Know which are your good sources. Really sort of work on your media and digital literacy there to know how you're being played, where are the good sites, where are you getting really sound information that is truth-based.
So Amy, in 1 minute, what have you got?
I was going to say, I think with the ABC, a lot of the fear would be taken away if we could find a way to actually lock in funding so it couldn't be used as a political football. So you weren't afraid, like we do with statutory appointments, you weren't afraid of what you were going to do or say because your funding was locked in for 20 years or so, and therefore no government could come in and scrap it. But I also think, like, don't lose hope. Just because you don't see young people in all the same spaces you are doesn't mean that they're not in spaces for themselves, learning, critically thinking, organizing, and deeply, deeply caring about issues, a lot of the time you've just aged out of those spaces, but it doesn't mean that they don't exist. And young people do still work with the ABC. They just do it in different ways. They're engaging with it in different ways. Media is changing. That is okay. We just have to make sure that what is left of media still has truth and credibility as its fundamental underpinnings.
Truth and credibility as the fundamental underpinnings. I think that's a good note to finish on. Thank you so much for a wonderful, lively discussion. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of the questions. There were way more than we had time for. But thank you everyone for coming along today. The next edition of Australia's Biggest Book Club is next week with Jeffrey Robertson. Should be a good one. That's on Friday. If you're interested in the Australia Institute's research, we're interested in facts, and you can find it on our website, australiainstitute.org.au. And you can buy a copy of Australia Institute Press's first book at your local bookshop or on the Australia Institute website. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.